So thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us this day. Um, would really, I would really like, as we go through this morning together, if we can remember that what we're talking about is not an intellectual exercise. It's not something just for our heads. Although the head may be the avenue that we use to get to the realization, but it's not about being in our heads, and it's not about being caught up in our emotions, although there is a sense of feeling involved. But what we are talking about is a realization that comes from the experience of the unity, the experience of the presence, the experience of God's unconditional love. And if we can get that, if we can work towards that, if we can do so on a daily basis, that gives our spiritual growth direction. That kind of gives us the focus that we need, the goal, if you want to call it a goal, the end point. What is it we're trying to get to? Why do we do this? Why do we come together? Why do we read? Why do we study? Why do we treat? Why do we pray? Why do we meditate? And we do all of these things for the purpose of the realization of the presence of God while we are still in the flesh, Many of us were told as children growing up that spirituality is something that happens after you die. So you die and then you go to heaven. Or you die and you wait until the end of time and then you go to heaven. Many different ideas in different cultures. But Dr. Holmes said that what we teach is practical mysticism, and the mystic is the one who experiences the presence of God practically while here in the flesh, in the now. And that's what all of this is about. So one of the things that certainly helps me when I just contemplate just how magnificent the divine is and how magnificent creation is to think of a starry night. When I was a kid growing up, we lived in the suburbs of New York City, and of course there was plenty of light pollution in those days, but not nearly as much as there is now. And I lived on a little island in a bay out by Kennedy Airport. And in the summertime, we could go to the end of the road where the street lights ran out, and we could sit out on the rock jetties there and just stare up at the sky. You could see the Milky Way, the big band of stars as they went through the heavens. And the longer we sat there, the more stars we could see. It was just awesome, just awe-inspiring. And I was reading in the news last week that astronomers have now come up with a new model of the universe, and they believe that they have underestimated the number of galaxies that existed in the universe by an order of magnitude of 10. That means there are 10 times more galaxies there than they previously thought. And I wonder if 100 years from now, if they're going to change that number again by an order of 10. But that gives us some idea of the scale at which God operates, at which the divine creates. I mean, before there were more stars in the heaven than we could possibly count. Even if we could count without losing track, we wouldn't live long enough to count to all of the stars that were in the universe. And as I was thinking of this, I just remembered when we were kids, I don't know why and I don't know who started it. You know how middle school crazy things go around. But one time somebody in the class started a contest if we were going to see who could count to the highest number without losing track. And the kids were doing this for weeks, you know, and they would come to school and they would say, well, I'm up to 9,972, you know, and we'd sit there during the day and you turn your head at your desk and look over and there's this kid just sitting next to you going, boom, 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 and they're counting. And of course, you know, they would lose track. They would lose track. It's darn, I got to start all over again. So you can imagine what that would be like, trying to count the stars in the heavens, and it's impossible. And then they multiply it by 10. Multiply it by 10. The human mind can't get around that. The human mind can't possibly understand that, you know. As I said in the opening, it's like a lot. There's a lot. You know, there's 1, 2, 3, and then there's a lot, you know. But if we can somehow feel or sense the awe of the incredible, incredible size of the universe, then we bypassed the intellect. We bypassed it. The mind can't count to it. The mind can't understand it. But there's something within us that can realize it and can appreciate it. And we can think about that and be skeptical and say, well, so what? You know, so it's a big deal. So there's a lot of stars in the heavens. What does that mean to me? How does that help me tomorrow when I get up to go to work? What is it going to do for me when I'm stuck in traffic? You know? Is it going to help me when I have to pay my bills or do all the other things that I need to do? And the answer to that is yes, it will. If we come to the realization, if we come to the understanding through the realization of our oneness with all of that, our unity with all of that. Dr. Holmes tells us in the very beginning of the Science of Mind textbook, he says there are more grains of sand in a handful of the beach than we can count. And yet mankind finds itself weak, tired, and afraid. He says the science of mind deals with this. The science of mind deals with this. See, what happens, or what has happened to us, remember we said last week we were kind of born into ignorance. You know, the Hindu tradition says that mankind has had ignorance heaped upon it. And it doesn't go into an explanation of who did the heaping or why, but that's their way of explaining our situation. The Judeo-Christian way of explaining our situation is that we've been expelled from the garden. Right? There was a time when we were one. We felt our oneness with the divine. And we have to remember in that mythology that even that explanation was limited, because even though Adam was experiencing the presence of God, he felt lack. According to the story, he was lonesome. He needed a mate. Now that's a story. That's a teaching story. It's a mythology. Right? But I just want to point out that even with this idea of the garden, the realization of the presence was not totally complete. There was something missing in that realization. But nevertheless, we've left the garden, whether we were expelled or we left of our own accord, so that we could discover life in some unique and wonderful way. People will discuss, but nevertheless, we're not in the garden. But there's a part of us that remembers it, you see. There's a part of us that knows about it. And there's a part of us that is constantly seeking this reunion, seeking to be whole again, seeking to be at one. You know? I like when you see atonement is at one-ment. Atonement is when we realize our oneness with God and all of life. So what this is telling us, what these stories are telling us is that somehow our experience of God at this time, somehow our realization of God at this time is incomplete. And we are in the process of working through our ignorance. We are throwing off our ignorance. We are awakening every day, a little bit more every day. We are awakening to the truth of the presence of the divine in us, as us. around us and through us. And of course, Dr. Holmes tells us that we had to be born with this incomplete knowledge. We had to come into this world with this incomplete knowledge, because if we were fully informed, we would be not individual. We would be, he called us automatons. I guess he wrote before robot was invented. They called them automatons. Right? We wouldn't be an individualized expression of God. We wouldn't be unique. So this period of darkness or ignorance in our lives is a necessary part of our growth in order for us to develop our unique personalities. But keep in mind that there's a part of us that remembers the garden. There's a part of us that wants to go back. And the mythologies tell us that there's two guards at the gate. Fear and desire are at the gate. That's what's keeping us. That's what's keeping us from getting back into the garden. Those are the things we must eliminate from our lives as we go along our journey. So we look at the abundance of the universe. We look at the stars in the heaven. We look at the grains of sand in a handful of the beach. We look at the number of fishes in the ocean or birds in the air, plants in the fields, trees in the forest. We look at all this and we say, so what? So what does that mean to me? What does that have to do with me as I'm living my life? And the only reason we could say that is because we feel separated from that. The stars are out there, the sand is down at the beach, the trees are over in the forest. The grass is something I have to cut every 7 days. And we don't stop. We don't stop as we did when we were kids. We don't stop to just be in the awe of the moment of realizing the spectacular nature of God. Dr. Frederick Bales, who taught with Ernest Holmes for many years out in California, and then went and pastored his own church separate from Ernest, still part of Science of Mind, but he pastored his own church, not co-pastored with Ernest. He wrote in one of his books that he was working with a client who was a very successful businessman, and he was suffering from anxiety. He was worried all the time, and he couldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep because of it. Couldn't get to sleep, and if he got to sleep, he woke up after a short time. And when he woke up, all of his business problems were rolling over in his mind. And Dr. Bale said to him, he said, can you tell me, is there some time in your life, is there some place in nature that you go, is there something where you can really sense and feel the power of nature, the power of God? And the man said, yes. He said, as a matter of fact, there is. He said, it's the sunset. Now, they lived out in California, and there the sun sets into the ocean. For those of us on the East Coast, the sun comes up out of the ocean. But in California, it goes down behind the ocean. It's quite beautiful. And this man said that he had a window in his home, and he could look out every evening, and he could see as the edge of the disc touched the water. He could just stop in the silence and be in awe at the magnificent order and harmony and power of God, of the universe, of nature. And Frederick Bale said to him, he says, well, good. He says, now you recognize it. He says, now what we need to do is get you to identify with it. What I want you to do is to realize that the power that you're recognizing is the power within you recognizing the power in the sunset. You would not even be able to imagine the power if it was not already within you, something within you. So think of deep calling unto deep, as Dr. Holmes would say it. Recognize that there is that within you which already knows that power, which already recognizes that power, which is that power. And when you start to recognize that all of the power of the universe is already available within you, and it knows what to do and it knows how to do it, then you can stop worrying, because you can give all your problems over to it. Right? Surrender. We talk about the last step of treatment, release. You can surrender your worries to that within you which knows how to do it, and the answers will come. And that's how the man was able to unify with the power that he knew to be there. So if we stop and think about this thing called life, and who we are and where we come from and where we go, and how we got here, and all the deep, deep questions of life, we start to recognize that all of creation, that which we can see and that which we can't yet see, all of creation is some part of the divine expressing itself in that particular way. In whatever way it chooses to express itself, the energy of the universe, or the unlimited stuff, as Dr. Holmes called it, would take the appropriate form at the appropriate time for that expression. And it does so in abundance. It does so bountifully. It becomes the stars and the planets and the moons and all of the objects in space. It becomes the plants, and it becomes the animals that eat the plants. And it becomes the humans, or sentient beings, wherever they may be, whatever they may be. We come to recognize when we can be in awe at the magnificence of what God has done, that we recognize that there is that within us that is recognizing part of itself out there. I am not separated from, I am not separate from, I am not different than God's creation. I am part of God's creation. A very important part of God's creation. I am one with this bountiful universe. I am one with all of the abundance that I see. Now, one of the things that happens to us as we come into the world and as we're growing is this idea of separation, and materialism is an idea of separation. We think that there's God, which is spiritual, and then there is matter, which is not spiritual. There's some very fundamental questions in philosophy that we have to go back and re-examine. I'll just give you one, for example. A definition of a miracle. Definition of miracle was something that the human mind can't explain. So something happened and the human mind couldn't explain it, and that was considered to be a miracle. Well, what that means is things that we couldn't explain years ago were considered to be miracles, but now we can explain them. So they're no longer miracles. When Newton discovered that a prism could turn light into a rainbow, well, people thought that that was heresy, because up until that time, well, a rainbow was something that God put in the sky. See, it was a miracle. God put the rainbow in the sky at the end of the flood, according to the story of Noah. So people believed when there was a rainbow that it was a sign from God. And all of a sudden Newton comes along and gives us a physical explanation that the raindrops act as prisms, or the moisture in the air acts as prisms, and the sunlight gets separated, and it causes the rainbow. And my point is that we have this kind of argument that says, if I can understand it, it is not the activity of God. And that's not correct. That's not correct. It's all the activity of God. Every bit of it is the activity of God. the sunshine and the rain and the rainbow and the clouds and the earth and the wind. It's all the activity of God. So what we have to do is get this idea of God is out there somewhere in spirit, and we are down here somewhere in matter, and we are separate and apart and different than. So we have to understand then that the very nature of the divine is without limits. There are no limits to it. And we can see that in its creation, in the multitudes of the different species, and in the population of each individual species, and the vastness of the heavens, which now, like they say, is 10 times, in a week it got 10 times bigger. It's 10 times bigger than we thought it was. And before that, we thought it was big. So there is this vastness of creation. There is this abundance in what God does. But the way that it does it, as best we can understand now, the way that it does it is it becomes what it creates. The unformed energy, which is some part of God, takes form at the appropriate time. And this is what we call the principle of supply. The principle of supply. Now, Joel Goldsmith will tell us is that we waste our time if we go around looking for supply. Because supply is invisible. You can't see it. Supply is like the truth. You can't see it. You can see symbols of supply. You can see the fruit on the trees. But the fruit is not supply. And the tree is not supply. But supply is this invisible process. This invisible process of the unformed stuff and substance. Ernest Holmes calls it the substance. Taking whatever form as may be appropriate at any particular time. So Goldsmith gives us the image of the orange tree. Excuse me. He says the orange tree is a demonstration of the principle of supply. We have the sunshine, we have the rain, we have the soil, we have the microbes in the soil, we have the minerals in the soil, and we have all these different trees in the soil. And we can have an apple tree sitting next to an orange tree sitting next to a pear tree. And they're each self-contained. They each have everything they need. Think about it. You pick up an acorn, it has everything it needs. Everything it needs right there. It just has to be connected to the ground. And once it is connected in the right conditions, the principle of life within it, the principle of life knows exactly what to do to take that tiny acorn and turn it into the mightiest of oaks, to take an orange seed and turn it into an orange tree, and so on. But each tree has within it the knowledge and the motive force to do whatever is appropriate. Excuse me while I get some water here. To do whatever is appropriate for its growth. The roots go down, the trunk goes up, the branches go out, the leaves come. The rain and the soil and the sunlight and the tree are all connected. They're all part of the same universe. They're all part of the same God. And all of this comes together in the roots, and it becomes sap, and the sap goes up through the tree, and the sap is just the sunshine and the rain and the soil taking a different form, but a form that is appropriate for that particular tree. And the tree next to it is going to do something slightly different, something unique to it. And a tree alongside that one is going to do something slightly different. But each according to its own, each one according to the intelligence and the life principle within it. Each one in perfect order is going to bring that sap up and run it out through the branches. And we're going to see buds form. And then after the buds form, then we're going to see blossoms. And then after the blossoms, we're going to see the fruit. The fruit is not the supply. The fruit is the symbol of the supply, the demonstration of the supply. The branch is not the supply. You can cut the branch off and take it home and nothing will happen. The tree is not the supply, but the supply is the life force, the intelligence within that knows what to do. Excuse me, knows when to do it, knows how to do it. That orange tree is part of the abundant universe, and it is able to give forth its fruit simply because it is part of the abundant nature of the universe. If we go forward and we pick all the oranges off the tree, the principle of supply is still there. And a new crop will come next year. And if that tree lives out its life and it dies, then its fruit will give us more trees. And the principle of supply continues on and continues on and continues on. Now we can do something that the tree cannot do. We can limit our connection to the divine. We can restrict it. It's still there. It's still unlimited. It's still ready, willing, and able to give of itself in a bountiful way through our lives. But it can only do for us what it can do through us. It can only do to us what it can do through us. Now the tree's connection to life is its very nature. It's its roots. It's its leaves. It's just its self. Its isness. Its beingness. And ours is as well. However, ours can be clouded by our consciousness, by our mind, by our beliefs. We could say to humans, it's done unto you according to your belief. You could say the same to the orange tree, it's done unto you according to your belief. But the orange tree doesn't have the same capability for belief that you and I do. It cannot think of itself as being separated from or different than. It just simply accepts its nature, and it is. See, we separate ourselves. We are born into a materialism, which is an ideology of separation. God is over there and matter is over here. And if we start to recognize then that everything is God, everything is the divine in action, that the glass of milk that we had for breakfast is as spiritual as a prayer, that it is the magnificence of God providing for itself exactly what is appropriate. I mean, think about that. The sunshine and the rain and the soil produce the grass. And the very life of God produces the cow, and the cow eats the grass, and they're two parts of the same whole. And then the cow produces the milk. And then we drink the milk, and the milk becomes part of our bodies. Everything is connected. Everything is part of the unity of the whole. And when we start to realize that everything in our lives, everything that is appropriate for our living is spiritual, the money we spend, the cars we drive, the houses we live in are all demonstrations of the principle of supply unfolding in our lives. Then we can come to trust it, trust the principle. See, in our materialistic way of thinking, we constantly think about what we have to do in order to get something. Something is out there and we have to get it to come to us. Money or cars or houses or whatever. We have to get something. We have to we have to engineer it. We have to sit down and have a plan. We have to design it. We have to work towards it. We have to map it out. We have to have steps. But you see, the orange tree doesn't have any of those things. What it has is its connection to God, its connection to life, its simple isness, its simple beingness. So as part of our spiritual growth, as we move through this life, what we come to do is start to shed these ideas of separation, to shed these ideas that divide us from the very things that are appropriate and necessary for not only our lives, but for the lives of all around us. We start to open ourselves up to an understanding of what the biblical story is telling us about. There's bread enough for today. There's manna enough for today. You don't need to try to save some for tomorrow. You don't need to try to eat yesterday's because it's gone sour and it's no good. Whatever needs must be today are provided for out of the abundance, out of the bounty, through this process, this creative process that Ernest Holmes called love, the self-givingness of God through the creative process. That the unformed, the invisible stuff and substance of the universe flows through us as the sap flows through the tree, flows through us, and takes whatever form or forms is appropriate in our lives at the moment. And Goldsmith goes on to tell us something even more interesting. He says that the fruitage, right, the signs following the fruitage, by their fruits you shall know them. You can tell my disciples by the signs following. For those who are getting in touch with the presence of the divine and allowing that intelligence that is within to do what it needs to do, what it knows how to do, to provide in a spectacular fashion, not for the purpose of showing off, but just because it's its very nature to do so. That the purpose of the fruitage is to give. Not to hoard, not to hold back, not to retain, but to give. You know, if you've ever had a garden and you grow tomatoes or cucumbers or things like that, you know, you have to keep picking. You have to keep picking the fruit, because if you let the fruit get ripe, the plant stops giving fruit. It's done. It thinks it's time to go to seed. It stops generating new fruit. So the thing you have to do is you have to constantly go out there every day. If your garden is in, you have to go out every day and you have to pick the fruit when it's ready. Because once it stops giving, it goes into a different cycle. It goes into a different phase of the cycle of life. It starts to shut down and die and prepare for the next generation, to let the next generation come along and be God's instrument of giving. So whatever it is that we are allowing to come through us, see, each of us is going to have something unique, as the orange tree is different than the apple tree or the pear tree. Each of us has some unique fruit to come through us, whether it be love or art or science or anything. Whatever it is that is our unique fruitage. It is not ours to hoard. It is not ours to keep. It is ours to share. It is ours to give. We take a deep breath and we step back and say, it's not ours at all. It never was. Can you imagine the orange tree saying, that's mine, that's mine? It just passed through. It just passed through that tree. We understand that. came from the sunshine, came from the rain, came from the soils. And by the intelligence of the life within it, by its own very nature, the fruit appeared. But it doesn't belong to the orange tree. It is the self-givingness of spirit through the creative process. It is God's love in action. So as we get deeper and deeper in touch with this spiritual idea of life, away from the materialistic idea of life, when we get deeper and deeper in touch with this spiritual idea of life, not just a mental image, but a realization that takes place somewhere in the center of our being. As we start to realize our oneness and our connectedness, we realize that that which guides the animals for thousands of miles on their migration is guiding us this very day to do what we can do, what we uniquely can do to express its love. Then we learn to surrender. Then we learn to trust. Eric Butterworth, in his book Spiritual Economics, he gives us an example of a young lady who was raised in a wealthy family in France, and she decided that she was going to give up her life of wealth and join a convent to be a nun. You remember in the olden times the stories of Francis of Assisi, who stood out in the middle of the town square and took off all of the clothes that his father had given to him and left the village naked to go and trust in God to provide. And St. Clare, the sisters of St. Clare, would do this, to completely trust in God. So this young lady decided that she was going to leave her home, her father's home of means, and she was going to go and join a convent. And she got up in the middle of the night one night, and she put on clothes that a common person would wear so that when she was on the street, nobody would recognize her. And she went down the stairs, and she was sneaking towards the front door in order to get out of the house without being detected. And she went back, and on the mantle over the fireplace, they had a coin jar where the people would put their coins, much as we do today. You come in and put your coins somewhere. And she reached in the jar and she took out a penny, because a penny was the price of a loaf of bread. And she was going to take that penny with her as she went through the door to completely trust in God. And she got to the door and she heard a voice, an inner voice. And it said, "What's the penny for?" And she realized that the penny was her sign of disbelief. She was going through that door to completely trust in God, but she was taking that penny with her. So she went and put it back. Our process of growth, our process of life, our process of being that best instrument of God's love that we can be is letting go of the things that we're attached to and we hold on, that tell us that we are less than, that we are separate from, that we are different than. And the gifts that we give to the world are the spiritual gifts of our being willing to being that open channel of God's love. The best that we can be today. And tomorrow will be the best we can be tomorrow. But today, to be the open channel of God's love, fully connected to the presence of the divine, releasing and let going of all of the pennies that we're holding on to, the ideas of lack, the ideas of limitation, the ideas of not being good enough or smart enough, releasing and let going of all of that, and letting the purity of God's love dissolve those things into the nothingness from which they came. Dr. Holmes tells us it makes no difference how long the room has been dark. Once the candle is lit, the darkness goes away. It makes no difference how long you and I have believed that we are separated from God, we are separated from all of life, that we don't even trust our own nature. Once we start to get that glimmer of the illumination, that this is a bountiful universe. This is a spectacular, spectacular place to be. And that includes us, and that needs us so it can work through us in some unique, in some wonderful way to work through us, to do what it already knows how to do, but it just needs that opening. So let's be that opening. Let's just be in silence for a little while today. Just be in silence today. Don't ask God for anything. Don't try to tell God how to do anything. Just invite the presence within that already knows what to do, as it knows how to put oranges on a tree. Let that presence within do whatever needs must be through you, through us, as you, as us, this day. We are the instruments of God's love here on this earth. We are the instruments of the bounty of God's love here on this earth. Whatever the world needs or thinks it needs, it needs the awareness of its unity with God, of its oneness with all life. And we can allow that to flow through our consciousness into the world. We can bless each and every one who is in fear, each and every one who is suffering, each and every one who is in pain, each and every one who is in lack. We can bless them by not buying into the appearances and recognizing the presence of God in the midst of every situation, leading, guiding, and guarding each and every one to do exactly what needs must be for their safety, for their food, for their clothing. We can be that instruments of giving, of sharing, of loving, of all that we have, and especially to be that channel for God's love to enter the world. So I invite us all this day to really take time to just be in awe at how magnificent life is, no matter what does it for you, whether it be the beach or whether it be the stars or whether it be a meadow, whatever it may be. Take some time to be with that and to recognize that that includes you. That includes you. You are one with all of this magnificence of life. It is doing its very best to give of itself through you, but it needs cooperation. It needs for you to make your connection by opening up your consciousness, by trusting, by surrendering, by blessing, by accepting. God loves the world by means of you. God loves you by means of the world. There's no apartness. There's no separation. I invite you today to realize that by experience. You are the very love of God in action. Don't be fooled by appearances. And so it is.